I never confronted my boss after he took credit for my project. That's the part people usually expect to hear, but it never happened. I didn't call him out in a meeting, I didn't go to HR, and I didn't correct him in front of anyone. I stayed quiet, and that silence ended up doing more damage than any argument ever could. I had been with the company for almost 8 years at that point. Long enough that people stopped noticing me, which, in hindsight, was part of the problem. I wasn't loud, I wasn't political, and I wasn't chasing visibility. I built things, complex systems that worked quietly in the background and made other departments look efficient. When something went right, no one noticed. When something went wrong, I was usually the one fixing it before it reached management. The project that changed everything took nearly a year of my life. It was a full redesign of an internal workflow system that multiple departments depended on. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was complicated. There were edge cases, dependencies, and small assumptions that, if handled incorrectly, could break everything. I documented all of it. I tested it repeatedly. I knew exactly where it was strong and where it was fragile. My manager, Mark, had very little to do with it. He checked in occasionally, asked surface-level questions, and nodded along when I explained things. Toward the end, though, something shifted. As the project gained attention, Mark started inserting himself more. He asked for copies of my slides. He requested summaries that I had already written. I assumed he wanted to be informed. I was wrong. A week before the final presentation to senior leadership, Mark announced that he would be presenting the project himself. He framed it as a leadership decision, something about alignment and clear communication. He didn't ask me if I was okay with it. He told me. I remember feeling something then, but it wasn't anger. It was a kind of clarity. I realized he didn't actually understand the project. He understood the outcome, the benefits, the talking points, but he didn't understand the structure underneath it. And more importantly, he didn't realize how much of that structure depended on details that weren't obvious from the slides. So I made a decision. I didn't change the project. I didn't sabotage the work I had done. I simply stopped protecting it. There were nuances in the system that only existed because I accounted for them manually. Assumptions that I corrected quietly. Conditions that needed to be handled in a specific order. I had always explained these things verbally when I walked stakeholders through the design. In the written materials, they were mentioned briefly, almost as footnotes, because they only mattered if someone tried to explain or demonstrate the system without understanding it fully. Mark never asked me to walk him through those parts. The day of the presentation, I sat in the room and said nothing. I watched him click through my slides, using my diagrams and my words, speaking with a confidence that only comes from not knowing what you don't understand. About 10 minutes in, someone asked a question. A reasonable one. Mark answered it incorrectly. Not obviously wrong, just slightly off. Enough that it caused a cascade of confusion. Then the technical issues started. Nothing dramatic. No explosions, no obvious failures. Just small problems. A demo that wouldn't load properly. A connection that dropped at the wrong moment. Systems that suddenly required explanations Mark couldn't give. Each issue on its own was manageable. Together, they turned the presentation into a mess. I could have stepped in. I could have clarified things. I could have fixed it. I didn't. I watched the room change. People stopped listening and started evaluating. Mark's confidence faded. His explanations became vague. The questions got sharper. What was supposed to be a showcase turned into a liability assessment. By the time the meeting ended, no one was congratulating him. They were concerned. They wanted follow-ups. They wanted documentation. They wanted reassurance that this system wouldn't cause problems once it was rolled out. Afterward, Mark didn't yell at me. He didn't accuse me of anything. He barely looked at me. A few days later, I was quietly added back into conversations I had been excluded from. A week later, I was asked to help clarify some of the issues leadership had raised. I didn't say, "I told you so." I just did my job. And for the first time, everyone could see the difference between owning a project and understanding it. The days after the presentation were quiet in a way that felt intentional. No one addressed what had happened directly, but everyone was reacting to it. Meetings were rescheduled. Emails included more people than before. Questions that used to go to Mark started coming to me instead, phrased carefully, as if no one wanted to openly acknowledge the shift that had just taken place. Mark avoided me at first. Not dramatically, not aggressively, just enough that it was noticeable. He stopped making eye contact in meetings. He delegated through intermediaries. When he did speak to me, it was clipped and overly professional, like he was afraid that saying too much might reveal how little he understood. Senior leadership, on the other hand, became very interested in details. They wanted documentation. They wanted contingency plans. They wanted to know what would happen if certain assumptions failed, or if certain dependencies behaved differently than expected. These were questions I had answered dozens of times before, just never in front of them. I responded the same way I always had, calmly, precisely, without emotion. I didn't reference the presentation. I didn't correct Mark publicly. I just explained the system as it actually worked. What changed was who was listening. Over the next few weeks, I found myself pulled into more conversations, planning sessions, follow-up meetings, risk assessments. Slowly, the project began to be referred to less as Mark's initiative and more as the system you designed. No one announced this change. It simply happened the way power often does, quietly and without permission. Mark tried to regain control. He scheduled meetings where he would speak first, framing discussions in broader terms, staying away from specifics. But the damage was already done. Every time someone asked a detailed question, the room turned to me. Every time a decision depended on understanding the mechanics, my input became necessary. I never contradicted him. I never exposed him. I didn't need to. People were seeing the gap for themselves. Eventually, there was a closed-door meeting I wasn't invited to. I found out about it later, not through gossip, but through changes in behavior. Mark's authority shrank. He still had the title, but less room to maneuver. Decisions he used to make unilaterally were now reviewed. Initiatives he proposed were met with hesitation. His confidence never fully recovered, because confidence built on borrowed understanding rarely survives scrutiny. A few months later, during a routine performance review cycle, I was reassigned. Not promoted, not announced, just repositioned. My role changed to something closer to what I had already been doing unofficially. More autonomy, direct communication with stakeholders, less dependence on managerial translation. Mark stayed. That surprised a lot of people. But staying wasn't the same as winning. He became careful in a way that slowed him down. Risk-averse, reluctant to take ownership of things he didn't fully understand. The same trait that had made him take credit in the first place now kept him from doing it again. I never felt triumphant about any of this. There was no rush, no satisfaction in watching someone else struggle. What I felt was alignment. Things were finally matching reality. A colleague asked me once, half joking, if I had planned it. If I had known the presentation would fall apart. I told them the truth, which was that I hadn't planned for anything to fail. I had simply stopped compensating for someone else's decisions. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear this story. They imagine some elaborate setup, some dramatic act meant to humiliate. There wasn't one. The system behaved exactly as it always had. The only difference was that the person explaining it didn't understand it deeply enough to protect it. Looking back, I don't think Mark was malicious. I think he was insecure. He wanted recognition without responsibility, visibility without vulnerability. And for a while that worked. Until it didn't. The project launched eventually. Successfully once the right people were involved. I continued doing the work I had always done, just without pretending that someone else was the reason it succeeded. And Mark learned something too, even if he never admitted it. He learned that taking credit for something you don't understand isn't power. It's exposure. After everything settled, life at work didn't suddenly become better or worse. It just became clearer. The invisible lines that had always existed were finally visible to everyone, including me. I understood where I stood, what my role actually was, and what it wasn't going to be anymore. Mark and I never talked about the presentation. Not once. There was no apology, no confrontation, No acknowledgement of what had happened. In a strange way, that silence was the closest thing to honesty either of us could offer. He knew. I knew that he knew. And that was enough. Over time, he stopped trying to position himself as the owner of other people's work. Not because someone told him to, but because the cost of doing so had become too obvious. Every time he stepped too far into details he didn't understand, the room noticed. Every time he stayed vague, people asked follow-up questions. He learned to stay in safer territory, and that territory kept shrinking. I didn't stay at that company forever. About a year later, I left on my own terms. No drama, no burned bridges. Just a quiet transition to a role where my work was more visible and my responsibility clearer. When I told people I was leaving, more than one of them said they weren't surprised. They said it in a way that suggested they had finally understood what I had been doing all along. Looking back, the part that stays with me isn't the moment the presentation fell apart. It's what came after. The slow correction. The way reality reasserted itself once I stopped smoothing over its rough edges. I didn't have to expose anyone. I didn't have to sabotage anything. I just stopped protecting something that wasn't mine to protect anymore. People often ask what the lesson is in stories like this. They expect something sharp or clever. A line about revenge or justice. I don't think it's that simple. What I learned is that a lot of systems only work because someone is quietly compensating for their weaknesses. When that person steps back, it feels like failure. But most of the time, it's not failure at all. It's accuracy. Credit doesn't mean much if it isn't backed by understanding. Authority doesn't hold if it can't survive questions. And silence isn't weakness when it comes from clarity instead of fear. I never corrected Mark in public. I never took anything back. I let the work speak for itself, and when it finally did, it said everything I needed it to say. That's why I don't think of this as revenge. There was no satisfaction in watching someone else struggle. What there was relief. Relief that I no longer had to carry something alone while someone else claimed it as theirs. Sometimes the most intentional thing you can do isn't to act. It's to stop.